Great. Well, welcome everyone to the Spring March 2026 Global Meetup of the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies. These are quarterly meetups that we conduct to connect with our colleagues abroad and share hopefully meaningful resources with them for their work and learn from them about their work. So today we're going to be recording a session that uh, allows us to bring in expertise from three colleagues of ours who we know from our Wisconsin networks. Two are based in Wisconsin, and one is from Wisconsin but is now based in London, England. Each of these experts is going to share top tips that they have learned about and some other background information from their work as fundraisers. And we recognize that where they're coming from and their perspectives is going to be fairly US focused, or in the case of Kelly in London, a little bit of a more sizable organization focus, working globally. But we hope that what this will offer to our global partners and the students that might hear this presentation is some perspective on how this fundraising activity and these endeavors look in this era, both in Wisconsin, in the US, and abroad. And then we will be available as a center to always distill later how some of these things might apply in your global context, recognizing there are differences across contexts. So we're going to start with Amanda White, who is one of our friends and colleagues who does fundraising in the Wisconsin, Southern Wisconsin context. And I'll turn it over to Amanda. And the three questions we're going to focus on a bit today are, what does your work look like? What do the trends look like in this work, fundraising in the 2020s, mostly in the US, but also a little bit globally when we turn to Kelly? What kinds of strategies have you been working on lately that might be sort of notable? And how does all of this relate to communications? Because we recognize that fundraising and communications strategies, especially in the digital age, tend to be very connected. And in fact, I'm going to reference that we did share some materials along with this session that include a webinar on like strategies for fundraising and communication that we did last year around this time, I think. So, and I want to say a big thank you to Dr. Laura Evans and Amelia Houle, who helped us set this up today. And we really appreciate your support. So, Amanda.
Yeah, great. I'll just share my screen. I just have a couple quick slides to share that are just broadly kind of show some data and trends at the national US level. So let me
And also,
share
each of you, if you don't
this.
mind just saying a little something about like where you're coming from in this work, like how did you get in, just a little bit about how you do your company or your organization, et cetera. Oh, there you go. You're going to start us off with that. So great. Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So I've been a fund development professional my entire career. So I don't know, 25 plus years. I've done a small bit of fund development on both the West and East coasts of the US, but primarily here in Wisconsin, in the Southern Wisconsin region. I've been a fund development consultant for going on 14 years. And it's just been a wonderful journey. I've had a chance to work with over 60 different nonprofit organizations of all sizes, all missions. And I really focus in on three primary areas. One is fund development, coaching, capacity building, planning. One is capital, multi-million dollar capital campaigns, planning, implementation, and then holistic strategic planning for nonprofit organizations. So today I was just going to kind of quickly share some of the national trends that we are currently seeing here in the US. Right now, as I put this presentation actually together about a month ago, and as of that time, the 2025 stats weren't all collected yet for like the last quarter of 2025. So still using 2024 stats in this, those should be out very soon. But basically in 2024, we saw $600 billion in giving to US charities. And that was a growth of 6% over 2023. It was a new high in philanthropy here in the United States. The interesting part of this is although there was a historic growth in philanthropy, the number of donors decreased by 4.5%. And I think that is a trend that we're seeing continue into 2025, that while happily philanthropy has been growing, the number of donors isn't. And I think that is a reflection of several things. One being, sort of um, growth within the very, very top tiers of society that may be imbalanced. It is the stock market here in the US holding out during difficult times, and those people with wealth doing well. And so we're seeing increases in major giving, but decreases in those $100, $200, $1,000 donors. Overall, in 2024, individual giving, so by individuals, was 2/3 of all giving, and that was actually up by 8%, because often what we see is major gifts are from individuals primarily, right? So that's where some of these stats are coming from. Overall, the types of mission-based organizations that are receiving philanthropy in the US is broken down here. And religion is the highest, it always is. We see the highest level of giving in religion. Human services and education, just under that. I always have a special place in my heart for arts, cultures, humanities, and environment, because they're down with the lowest level of philanthropy, unfortunately. And certainly in Wisconsin, I can't speak to the whole US, but in Wisconsin, where actually our state gives one of the lowest levels of support, public support to the arts and culture, we're seeing some real challenges for those groups here in Wisconsin. If we look at the first 3 quarters of 2025, what we're seeing is not quite as much growth as we saw necessarily in 2024, although it'll be interesting to see those final fourth quarter 2025 stats, because there was anticipated high giving end of year. But basically there was a slight decrease in giving in those first 3 quarters, which I don't think is surprising, given we had such a traumatic year here in the US politically. A lot of people, just anecdotally, I can say, a lot of the groups that I worked with, their major donors in the first couple quarters were either giving to very specific causes, like immigration, human services that were being cut, or they were holding off because it was a wait and see. They weren't sure what the market was going to do. There was a lot of uncertainty, just so much uncertainty. So it was a wait and see. However, Giving Tuesday, we do have stats from that increased by 13% in Giving Tuesday in the last quarter of 2025, and raised a high of $4 billion. So I think if we get those final fourth quarter stats, we're going to see actually quite an increase in giving, because a lot of people were holding off in those first few quarters. And then the last thing I just wanted to share is the great wealth transfer. So we're hearing so much about this, especially in the philanthropy world. And that really picked up speed in 2025. 91 heirs inherited $300 billion in 2025 worldwide, which is just unbelievable, right? And we won't go into the politics of that or how we all feel about that, but that is the case, that 91 people inherited 300 billion. 18 of these 91 heirs inherited 96 billion in North America alone. And the estimates are that 124 trillion will be transferred by 2048. So here in Wisconsin, we're not seeing most, if any, of this huge wealth transfer to these very specific heirs. But we are seeing the baby boomer generation begin to recreate legacy gifts and those and have those estate plans. So even though it may not be billions of dollars, there still is quite a bit of wealth transferring in the upper middle income tiers as well. And so what I'm telling my clients right now is if you don't have a legacy giving plan, start one literally today, this afternoon. Create those programs and plans. If you have them, make sure that you're really promoting them, because we are going to see we are starting to even see an unprecedented transfer of wealth, not just here in the United States, but in different pockets of the world. And so that's just a really important, and the great news is setting up a legacy giving program at your nonprofit, whether you're a very small nonprofit or you're a very large nonprofit. It's not that complicated. It's not that difficult. You create a legacy giving society, you promote it, you talk to your most loyal donors about the fact you have this legacy giving program available. And you will start to see if you have some strategy at points where you're talking to people about this, you will start to see commitments made. Um, and so, just a reminder that 2025 was just a year unlike any others. I don't have to remind you all of that. Like it was just an insane, and unfortunately, some of the craziness continues. But we are seeing, at least here in Wisconsin, the need dramatically increasing, and I think that's true, obviously, across the world. And funders being very focused on immediate needs. So again, those other groups that don't necessarily have a mission that's kind of in the spotlight. Funders are very, very focused on immediate need, and not so much as arts and cultures and some of these other things. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So that's me. That's happy to answer questions or share any other information that's helpful. Oops, you're muted.
That was amazing, Amanda. That is such helpful background for setting the stage of where we are in 2026. I know you've only got a couple more minutes with us, but could you share just in the briefest of terms, what is a legacy giving program for those that are unfamiliar?
Oh, sure. Sure. Yeah. So when folks, and here's the thing is people don't have to have great wealth to have an estate plan, right? It's really recommended that everyone have an estate plan. Even people who are 25, 30 years old still have an estate plan for any savings, any assets, anything that you own. So there's a clear path for where that will go when you pass away.
Yeah,
And I think often, I think too many people think, oh, well, I don't have huge wealth. I just have a house that I've somewhat paid off or something, but still it's important to have that plan, because there's something that needs to happen with that after you pass. And a lot of people, if they have children, they're passing the majority of their wealth often to their children, but they still have those nonprofits that are near and dear to their heart that they might
a
include
portion.
1% or
Yeah,
2% or
yeah,
5% of their estate to go to those nonprofits. And the thing
yeah,
is, if you're even talking about $500,000 or $250,000 in a house, that's still a strong gift to your organization if it's 1% or 5%. And
yeah,
so, we know that in the nonprofit world, one of the biggest reasons people don't give, whether it's a regular donation, a legacy commitment in your estate plan, is simply because they weren't asked. So starting a legacy program often means that you've got a legacy giving society where maybe once or twice a year in your annual report, in a newsletter that you're doing, you just give a shout out to those folks who have told you, hey, just so you know, I'm putting you in my will for 1% of my estate. awesome. Let's celebrate those people. And then by doing that, you can also then say, and we'd love to have more people engaged in this special program that we've created, because these legacy gifts are often the largest gifts that nonprofits receive. And they're often sort of a surprise, because we can't plan. We don't want to plan for this, but we need to have a program that encourages people to remember us in their end of life plans, because it can make such a dramatic impact for your organization.
Yes. Brilliant, brilliant insights, Amanda, and I look forward to connecting with you more as time goes on. We appreciate having your expertise here today and in our community. We'll let you move on and I'll transition to some next folks. But thanks again. Really
Okay.
appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Goodbye. So before I pass to Kelly, I'm going to just mention for our audience, both globally and in Wisconsin, our students that may be less familiar, that it is true in my career that in the US, we have seen many anecdotes and stories of, you know, someone passes away, someone dies, and a nonprofit discovers later that they had mentioned that nonprofit in their will. And so this idea of nonprofits receiving funds from someone after they pass away, when they're what we call in the US is like their estate planning or their trust and estates process occurs because of they have passed away. That's a long-standing tradition in the US that has always come up here and there. But I do think this idea of a more deliberate plan for nonprofits to encourage people to do that is a new trend, or maybe not a new trend, but a recent trend. And with regard to global organizations, I recognize that perhaps in country that might not be as common or available as an option. But I do think it is an option to be aware of that is happening here in the US, especially if you're an organization that is seeking more international partners. For example, if you're a local organization globally that does have some donors in the US, this might be a possibility for you to think about. And I think one of the things we see with global organizations is that those types of numbers that Amanda was talking about, those are big numbers. Like even more modest ask in of a U.S. donor for a global organization that they have some affinity for could make a really big difference. So those are just my little contextual thoughts there. But I will turn it over to Kelly to see what her insights are on the three questions that we're kind of talking about today. And be sure to share with us your background as well, Kelly. Thanks so much.
Of course. Thank you so much, Mary Beth. So as Mary Beth mentioned, my name is Kelly Douglas, and I work for an organization called Health Poverty Action. And my history is one from South Central Wisconsin, and so grew up, born and raised in South Central Wisconsin. Went to Madison for undergrad, and then decided quite uniquely in middle age to transition and get a master's program in the UK, and was very, very fortunate to find Health Poverty Action, which does feel like an organization that's a kindred soul to me. So I do feel very grateful. Now I've been working there for just over 7 years. And so most of my background is in more community fundraising, working with community-based kind of grassroots organizations. I did have a brief stint with fundraising through one of the units at the University of Wisconsin in the law school. And now this is my first kind of work with global development, as you might historically say, just to give context, but we would kind of use some different language. So most of my work, so I had a fundraising department that oversees different types of fundraising, while some of my programmatic colleagues work with some of our larger institutional funders. So I'll be kind of coming from a place of, trust foundations, community partners, and individuals. And that's kind of more my ballpark than some of the larger governmental institutional funders. So essentially, as people may know, there's been a little bit of a shakeup globally when it comes to funds that started with the president restructuring and to some degree dismantling USAID, which is obviously one of the largest funders globally to support development and across health, education, and livelihoods. There's a number of issues that it kind of covers. And so that has really set off, and some people might not know that a lot of other governments followed suit. So, for example, the UK government followed that path set by the President of the United States and also cut its global development budget, or overseas aid, as it's often called. And so we see a lot of organizations ceasing to exist. We see a lot of organizations merging. We see a lot of organizations struggling and trying to readapt to this kind of new landscape. And so it's been quite interesting, even, kind of transitioning from the US to the UK scene. And Mary Beth, we kind of discussed a little bit briefly about the different types of culture around giving. In the UK, United Kingdom definitely has a different culture around giving than the US. Whereas the US, it's almost kind of taken for granted, and that this is something that you do. There's kind of a tithing culture, as Andrew talked about, kind of the historical underpinnings. Whereas in the UK, there are different ways to get status. There are different ways that people give. So, and different taboos about talking about money openly. So it's been a really interesting way to transition. And we're also looking at raising funds from individuals. And our first step is looking at kind of Eastern Africa, so specifically Kenya. So we're finding out more about kind of giving culture in different parts of the world too, which I find interesting. Essentially, what my organization or kind of my team tends to do is focus on individual, legacy giving, community, corporates, trusts, and foundations. So that's kind of what we oversee. And that's across the UK, but we also have a US office based in Madison, Wisconsin. So we're a little bit stronger and more developed in the UK fundraising scene and European fundraising scene. But we also are developing, kind of tapping into some of the connections that I've had in Wisconsin to develop our US-based giving too. So I think what I would say as far as like what we tend to do and what strategies that we use, because we're really focused on unrestricted giving, we really look at kind of what fits our organization. So sometimes people have very kind of easily recognizable messages. So if you're a prostate cancer organization, people can kind of piece together quite quickly and easily what you do. Because Health Poverty Action's mission is quite complex. So we're working in relationship over long periods of time to shift health systems in collaboration with local communities, local leadership, local government. And we kind of address this kind of intersection between poverty and health across a wide variety of issues. So that might look like maternal health, solid nutrition. It might look at livelihoods, making sure that people have enough money to kind of take care of their family and be kind of have a decent livelihood. We have education, we have protection from harm. So we work a lot on gender-based violence. And then we also do some things that kind of address environmental concerns. So we've also worked on solar. Because the relationships are centric, we're doing what is most beneficial to the communities within which we work. So we don't have that kind of key expertise. And while we fundamentally believe in this mission and how we do the work, and it's employing local people who understand the culture, the language, you're not going to see people like me in kind of the rural Rwanda working with kind of women who've had issues with gender-based violence and are don't necessarily have economic independence. So we're working with local people. So that is quite a complex mission or a complex message to try to get across. So we know that things like print ads aren't really successful for us because we can't really get the magic of who we are and why that's so special across in a very simple print ad. So what we know is that dialogue works best for us. So we're creating opportunities to look at like, okay, how do we get people on the phone? How do we get people in person so that we can kind of help them understand what we do and tell them a story, utilizing a specific person, because after all, people still care about the human element. So we're still sharing people's stories. But I think that, so for us, we knew kind of rules, or like in an application for a trust or foundation, we have more words to be able to describe kind of who we are and kind of our unique selling points. So I think that kind of ties in a little bit with our communications as well and how we approach things. We've also made things slightly difficult for ourselves because we're trying to exist in line with our values. So essentially, we basically redid our messaging about 8 years ago. and really looked at kind of like through the lens of values and frames theory. Because what we're trying to do, instead of kind of the traditional fundraising, especially in the context of aid narrative, of really kind of building upon pity or shame or guilt by showing, children with flies around them and like distended bellies from malnutrition, instead of framing it through that, we're trying to frame it through um, imagery and messaging that kind of taps into people's values around equity, justice, hope, what's possible. So we're trying to look instead by showing, the world that we want to see, the solution, the internal capacity of people, and recognizing the systems within which they live are designed to kind of keep them in poverty, to like kind of work against them. So we're looking at not only addressing kind of what these immediate needs are, but how they exist in the system that keeps people in the places that they are, with kind of with nothing kind of inherently wrong with the humans that are in the situation, really focusing on the situation. So we did a lot around that, but it kind of takes away some of that donor centrism. It takes away some of that savior, tapping into that savior complex that really works for a lot of donors because they want to know that they're doing well. They want to feel good about giving. And so we've taken a little bit of that away, and we've taken a little bit about like, oh my God, health poverty action is so amazing. Because it's just like all we're doing is trying to create a level playing field so that people can excel based on their own natural determination, their own natural capacity. But it kind of turns a lot of the fundraising messaging on its head.
Yeah.
So we try to kind of educate people like that, hey, we're doing this. And we're doing this a different way. But it does, again, make the message a little bit more complex because people, to some degree want to see the problem. So we're almost trying to take kind of donors or potential supporters on that journey with us and why we're doing this, because historically, aid messaging has been incredibly terrible for the image of, people in so-called developing countries. And so, we don't want to kind of further this message that there's something kind of inherently wrong or that, people are incapable of taking care of themselves. So it's kind of turning things on its head. And we've seen now more charities. We were one of the first international organizations focusing on these types of messages. And in the early days, we were talking to the big dogs, these high level organizations, and they're like, show us it works for fundraising. And, so we've been one of the kind of champions of this type of communication. The only other thing I wanted to say, Meredith, because you did tap into the unrestricted aspect. And I don't know how familiar people are with like full cost recovery processes, but that's something that we focused a lot on. So essentially full cost recovery is ensuring that all the—
Can you repeat the term? Can you just clearly repeat the term? I want to make sure I have it.
Of course. So we call it, and there could be a number of ways that we name it, but we call it full cost recovery. So we're recovering the full cost of the program. Okay. So oftentimes when you build out, let's say we're working on a maternal health program, and we have all the costs associated with the project, so that could be staff time doing training, it could be stipends for, transport, it could be, working with community health workers. There's all these kind of costs. But then all the costs of the organization basically exist because of the cost of, because of the project. So we want to make sure when we're advocating with our larger funders that we're incorporating fair cost recovery to ensure that we're not undercutting ourselves, because we wouldn't need offices, we wouldn't need phones if we didn't have projects. So that ensuring that we're putting all of those as kind of direct project lines, plus the kind of 15%, 10 to 15, or if you have a very generous donor, 20% overheads that do cover things like communications, fundraising, all these things. But we did a global process, actually. So working with all our kind of global leadership on what are those costs that typically don't get covered, and how do we make, again, try to educate donors so that they understand the actual cost of the project. Because I think we operate quite lean. We're not extravagant. We don't even have a centralized office. So we really want almost all the resources to go to the project. But there are certain things like financial accounting systems that are global that create transparency, that we would include that as one of the essential costs of the programs, instead of putting that in the overheads. So, I mean, and anybody who's interested in that, I'm happy to share kind of our process and how we shifted this globally. And we created so that because we have so many people who are submitting applications, especially institutional applications, that we want to ensure that we're recovering as much of those full costs as possible, because our unrestricted budget, that's always like the gold mine, and everybody wants like a piece of that unrestricted, but you can't cover everything. So being really intentional about what you cover through the kind of budgeting process as part of your applications or your proposals is going to be absolutely key. And I'm happy to share kind of the tips, because it's a relatively new area that people are just kind of like digging, or like the last few years, people are just digging into how to do this well. And I think we've uncovered some pretty successful secrets. I think we within the first year we increased our unrestricted giving by over £400,000, and just by kind of utilizing this method. So it was helpful. So I just wanted to put a little kind of shout out to full cost recovery, because I think that those being really intentional about that process can be really useful.
Yeah, and I think, thank you, Kelly. I was going to chime in because I'm excited to reflect back some things, but did you have more that you wanted to deliver before I get into that?
I think those were most of the notes that I had pulled together. But of course,
Okay.
if there's anything else that you want me to tap more into, I'm happy to expand.
Yeah, I just want to reflect back. I mean, I love having Kelly share with us because Health Poverty Action, the organization that she works in the development department for, is a very exciting example of a organization based in the global north, in the UK and the US, that is working with partners all over the globe and taking this very like ecological approach or social determinants approach, where there is a element of really co-creating what the intervention should be with the local community. That's not just like putting a bandage on one thing, but looking more comprehensively at how to support communities making progress towards more sustainability, more thriving for their members. And so the range of projects that Kelly alluded to, like looking at energy, looking at certain health issues, looking at like sustainable economies for families, all these things are part of that work. And I love the way that Kelly, you refer to the way that by taking that comprehensive, collaborative approach, you do create some challenges with complexity for how to tell the story, how to get people on board, how to make sure donors see how giving to this kind of a thing has real impact, even if it's not just like that easy message of like, you bought like 1,000 lunches for school kids, because I think there is a compulsion in the fundraising world, I think sometimes, to be able to break things down into like little neat packages. And this kind of work is not gonna allow for that. And I think that's an intentional choice that is quite compelling. I also think that the cost recovery piece reminds me of how in the US and abroad, we're talking a lot about how we need to get away from overhead being a dirty word, because organizations that support this kind of complex programming have to have a nucleus. They have to have a staff. They have to have electricity and an office, right? And there had been a trend before recently where everybody was saying like, we only charge 3% overhead or something. And that's nice if you can make the case that the dollars are going to the end user, but it also might sort of cut at the reality that many organizations still have to live with, which is they still need to raise money for their operations, right? And
And especially
I
if you
would
have,
take,
sorry, Mary
yeah,
Beth, especially if you have things
no,
like safeguarding, financial accountability, and like to
yes,
have a healthy, sustainable organization.
yes,
3% sounds
yes,
impressive to a donor, but that's probably not the most sustainable organization. I'm speaking from an organization who's been well below the line. I know how difficult that is. And it's something
yes.
that we've been trying to kind of expand to ensure that we have, that we're putting the investment. We're not kind of overworking our staff. We're putting the investment into kind of that infrastructure to make sure that we're running things as still at the highest value for money, but in a responsible, sustainable way. So sorry to
Yes.
interrupt, but you just tapped into
No,
that.
I appreciate that so much because organizations, it does cost money to do this work responsibly and well, right? Um, so the last thing I'll mention from what you said that I want to just like put out there as a thought for anyone watching this video or maybe to parlay into Jen's presentation or comments is that I've also been thinking a lot about this almost um, intersection between some of the things we teach from our center about volunteer engagement and like sort of the way that a volunteer program in an organization can build a community with people that care about your cause and get people more involved at the ground level with what's going on. That's not going to be available for every organization, but some of those themes I think relate to this idea that you brought up of like bringing donors along for the journey and bringing donors along as partners. And I'm hearing about this right now. I'll give an example from domestic context, which is there's a lot of immigration related stuff happening in the US right now. And Amanda actually mentioned this. You see a lot of donors and citizens being very passionate and wanting to get involved. And organizations I've talked to that are saying we've got an overwhelming amount of inquiries about people wanting to be a part of that. And what I think this indicates, which is relevant for this conversation, is that people are willing to give money, but they also really passionately want to be a part of the causes that they care about. Sometimes it's possible to create volunteer opportunities or events or informational correspondence that makes them feel a part of that. It has to be curated carefully for the cause. But I'm going to just put out there that I think it's a really juicy, beautiful time to think about how your donation or fundraising activities can also be paired with that kind of a relational thing with people to make them feel a part of what the work is because people are living in a world where they feel like bombarded with the news and they might be willing to cut a check or make a donation, but if you can give them that feeling that they're a part of positive change, maybe by sharing more information or having meetings with them about what's going on and really telling stories or inviting them in some more substantive way, I think that's I'll be interested what Jen or Kelly have to say about that, but I think that's something to think about right now. And I think for global organizations, if they can figure out ways to tell their stories and make people in the global north or their donors feel a part of that, that's probably a pretty winning strategy. What do y'all think about that?
I can just step in quickly. With our individual supporters, we created kind of like an inner circle. And I mean, you'll see this
Yeah,
across major giving, like giving societies, those types of things. But we, even for people that are give a fiver a year or a fiver a month, we wanted to kind of create this opportunity for people to kind of join the movement more formally.
yeah,
And then they get
yeah,
kind of like special insider communications. They get more kind of access to our CEO. That there's kind of like certain, again, like insider tracks that they're getting that the general public doesn't. And then again, we're trying to create it. And we had, we were kind of working through the language, like what do we call that? Do we call them comrades? Do we call them like
yeah,
community? Do we call them friends? There's all these
yeah,
ways that kind of, again, based on your mission and kind of the people you work with, there's all these kind of interesting branding and, kind of naming conventions that you can kind of make, kind of pull people in your branding. So we had a slightly different branding for this that we made that was specifically, kind of this insider group. So I do think that's an important, and obviously with major donors having those kind of maybe more verbal conversations, or again a different type of insider, higher level access. And I think that can be really useful to make people feel like part of you and connected to the mission.
beautiful. I might have picked up some of this thinking from hearing you allude to that in previous conversations, Kelly, but beautiful example. So let's turn it over to Jen. Jen, very happy to have you here today. I've known your work for many years, and I know you'll share with us some great insights. So the floor is yours.
Thanks. I just want to jump in as we kind of wrap that piece of the conversation, and maybe
Yeah,
so I'll start with the last question of communications is, ultimately like that is it is bringing people closer, and that's when you get into the more detailed information. And I think that's a little bit of what Kelly was kind of sharing, right? Is that our initial might be that we have this very large group, that we have a message for, but we're kind of seeing who is wanting to be closer to us. And that's when we can give more information, more complex kind of theory, or why are we doing this? And so, as people kind of initiate, sometimes through a gift, but sometimes through like, yeah, I want to do that. Bring them closer, give them more information, kind of build them up to be your advocates. And I think too, what you were saying about volunteers is, for some, we don't have a volunteer role, that we can give them. It might not be how our organization is structured, or we might just be at capacity. We may just have already enough volunteers. So really, how do we kind of give them more information so that they can go out and become an advocate? That is a volunteer role. That is a way that they can support. But I think for most organizations, the messaging is always complex. What we do is pretty detailed. We are often the experts in that. So that's hard to tell to a mass audience, but you do have these pockets of folks that have said yes, and they can handle more information because they're already kind of in on that big mission. So that just kind of distill them down, and it's okay to have those groups of people, your legacy donors who have said, I'm gonna put you in my will, those who are donors, and maybe at certain levels, you can kind of bring them into groups and share more complex ideas, more information, because they can handle it. They already know that piece. So yeah, just want to kind of follow up on that before I jump into anything else in that space.
Beautiful.
So
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and other insights you'd offer.
Yeah. So thank you for, again, having me. It's already been a great conversation. I'm Jen Davie. I am in also the Madison area. Live just outside of Madison, and have been in fundraising for about 20 years and have done it my whole career. Have been on the consultant side for about 8 years, and really have been enjoying the opportunity to focus in on nonprofits that need development support but can't fully kind of take on the whole role. So many organizations that I support have either no fundraising staff. They may be a board who is working on it, or only an executive director whose role it is to also fundraise. But a couple of my organizations will have 1 or 2 staff, and often it's that they're taking on some sort of project or learning something new that is outside of their kind of area of expertise. And so kind of looking for somebody to bring in and support them. So my goal is always like, I can do it because I've done it, as most of us have. But I also want to make sure we're creating a process or teaching somebody else so that it is not always relying on an outside person to do that. So I think that's just an important reminder, is there are very few who are fully trained in fundraising. It is not something that I think you ever stop learning. So to be an expert is quite a thing to achieve. So we're all learning, and we can all kind of support each other in that. But just to keep learning what works for you, as Kelly said. I took down so many notes as Kelly was talking, and Amanda too, like, yes, that's a great way to talk about it and to say it. And, we don't hear, I think we have a similar concept of that full cost recovery, but it is often kind of overshadowed with like, never mind, what's your overhead? And ultimately, I don't have overhead if I don't have a program. I don't need HR if I don't have anybody working in my program. So one does not exist without the others, so I love kind of that piece. I think one thing I wanted to just talk about that hasn't been brought up is I've been spending a lot of time kind of reading, learning what people are doing with monthly donors. And I'll bring it a little bit larger and just talk about like recurring donations. I think often we've had the recurring donations in terms of, this is an annual donor, and if they come back every year, and we hope they come back every year. And because we often have a large group, we're just kind of churning through that big group and saying, well, they give in December. and that's when we'll talk to them. But this kind of thought of how do we bring them closer? And so I've watched a lot of things from Dana Snyder, who runs a lot of programs about monthly giving, and just her framing of this is people who believe in you. Like, how do you bring people closer who believe in you? And one of those ways is kind of that monthly recurring donation that we understand that there's bills due, that this program is running and it's consistent. And how do we get them to kind of say, yes, I'm in this with you for a little bit of a longer term? So I think, really kind of how do you take that concept and make it work for what you're doing? How does that align with your communications messaging to once you do say, yes, I believe in the work that you're doing, here's an avenue and a path to get involved. And I don't know how that plays out kind of on the international scale. A lot of here is inviting like US nonprofits into the tech kind of piece of it. And really, how do you set up all of your technology to make this really easy for a donor? And that's something I've been struggling with because most of the people that I work with are really small. And tech comes at a cost. The ability for us to respond the same way as some of our large subscription-based tech companies, yeah, of course you can turn off and on your Netflix and no problem, and there's probably a bot that answers you. Like, that's not who we want to be. And the tech is pretty big, for us to be able to do that. So I think that us exploring how we can still be kind of focused on the human aspect of it, hold true to that's how I think our sector operates with a donor, but also bringing them into kind of that partnership that I might not be able to respond in that same subscription-based way, but I have this kind of partnership here with you. Like, I guess I'd rather take the call for you to say, can I pause my monthly donation? Than you be able to have the access to turn off or turn on your donation. So I think that's, also plays into that communications piece that when somebody kind of raises their hand for a recurring gift, they're saying something different than your one-time donor or your even annual donor that kind of does that. But how do we as organizations support their thinking process to what really supports us? If we've trained them, we'll send you something once a year. As Amanda said earlier, like, then that's our ask to them. And that's how they respond. So what do we want to do different to invite them to say yes to us in a different way, I think is kind of important. So just want to kind of like touch on those that maybe added to what Amanda and Kelly had already said and shared.
That's great. And I'm going to just chime in on that one bit, which is I do see from my global work that organizations that are working abroad or that are in a different national context will have sometimes varying access to things like online donation portals and things. But there is also a reality where there are several organizations now in the United States, in the UK, in Europe that create like a hub for like small grassroots organizations in like the global south, for example, to be listed on their site. And then there's a pipeline for the donations to flow through that like hub site and then to the organization. So if anyone's listening to this that is in a small organization abroad that does not have the ability to receive direct donations through an online portal, those kinds of organizations can be a pathway and a way to build awareness with donors that are already looking at those sites for a variety of causes. Jen, can you just say a little bit more about like if you are working with organizations, especially the smaller ones that you mentioned, like might not have all the bells and whistles for tech, do you get into with your work with them advising on like how to just keep awareness of the organization going or how to get like new people paying attention or new donors or make sure that your communications do sort of like continue to build goodwill with donors, just anything about that like intersection of like social media or communications or email campaigns or letters or whatever the things are that you're doing? Like what's going on with that right now for your consulting?
Yeah, I think I would share that, sometimes we feel like all we do is talk about our organization. And then when we really, though, kind of think about it, is like, who are we talking about it to? And how are we saying that invites somebody into it? Because sometimes we can I'm doing all this, right? So we might be talking to somebody who's already in it and, they know what we're doing. But two, the way that we kind of talk about it to bring people in, I think is the really important piece. And you mentioned kind of, right, a lot of tools out there, you can go to social media, other kind of places. I think one of the biggest things, and even if you're in person talking to somebody, is how are you going to invite them into kind of your maybe atmosphere of like, what do you have control of, right? Social media at any moment could go away. It could just change the algorithm and we don't appear for people.
Yeah.
And so, right, those things are beyond our control. So I think one of the things is, how are we talking about what we're doing in a way that lets people say, I'm interested, and how do I kind of stay interested with you? And so thinking about what tools you control, are you having them sign up with a newsletter where you're the ones distilling the information back out to them, and growing? But I do think it goes back to put yourself in places that you can talk about your work that does let people have that moment that's like, I didn't know about that. I didn't know. And I say that a little bit I mentioned I've only been doing fundraising, and there are days when I talk to my husband, partner of 20 years, and he will be like, I didn't know that existed. I'm like, oh, I'm
Yeah.
working with that. But even, right, somebody so close to you that I didn't
Yeah.
explain it in a way that resonated.
Yes.
And the same thing, I have friends who go like, oh, I wish there was this answer. I'm like, there's a nonprofit that does that work. Like, let's get you
Yeah.
connected. So I
Yeah.
think you can just keep sharing your story with as many people as possible, but in a way that invites curiosity and invites engagement back to you.
Yeah, I really love this is a very 2026 conversation because I do feel like in the early like years ago, like not so long ago, we still had this like idea that you could just gin up your social media platforms and like everybody would like know who you were and that would actually reach people. And I think to just sort of track what has happened, like the engineering of the algorithms for profit essentially has like really changed that. And it's really unfortunate in some ways because I remember the earlier days of Facebook, for example, with nonprofit organizations, and it was a very robust place to like list a nonprofit event and people to be able to hear about it. And that actually was like the best case scenario, in my opinion, of what Facebook could be, which was like so effective for like knowing about community events and causes and stuff. But now what we know is you can post information and it's just like it's totally unclear like whether anybody will see it. And frankly, if it is an organization doing the posting, I personally think like everybody's reached the conclusion that you have to pay for pushes to basically for that to get out because they know they don't want to just give free pathways for great like viral attention for organizations. Like a person might get that, but an organization's not going to get that. Another thing I have seen changing a little bit too is just like the platforms that people are using. Like I am no expert in this, but I do think like LinkedIn, for example, has taken on new meaning because it is like regarded as a more professional space. And so people that are genuinely looking for more substantive content about like good work happening, that might be a better place now than like mixing it up with all the personal and like entertainment stuff that's happening in the other places. But then TikTok, on the other hand, is a place where that's a dubious one for various reasons for different groups. But like this notion of like viral content there has presented almost like the opposite extreme, which is like organizations have been able to get traction there by being entertaining and like a little bit more just like frivolous or whimsical or whatever. So the thing that I just say about that is like, this is going to be an ever-changing landscape. And your point is such a good one for the filter to think of, which is like, who am I trying to reach? And like which methods and approaches are going to make the most sense for that. So it looks like Kelly has mentioned a few things in the chat. I just wonder if you want to voice them for like the video viewers really quick.
Of course. And I'd be kind of curious about Jen's experience if she's more familiar with this. Have you heard of Fundraise Up, Jen?
I Googled it right away when you put it in the chat.
Okay, so we had to set up when we incorporated our nonprofit in the US. We're quite small, and we're operating on like fumes and a prayer essentially. So we were looking for really low cost opportunities upfront. And so for some of the smaller charities, I don't know, this has been like 4 or 5 years now that we installed Fundraise Up, but we wanted a professional interface and a way to give on a site. They set it up for free. So in cost comparison, all the others were like thousands and thousands of dollars up front. And then this was a free, and I'm not affiliated, I'm not getting any money from this, but we did use them for Health Poverty Action USA. And not only can you give one-off gifts, but it manages recurring gifts incredibly well. So I gave to my organization just to kind of test it out. And it's really nice. They send automatic messages. They give you anniversary notifications. So much of it, you can customize like built-in messages with your imagery for your organization. So it is really customizable, and they put a lot of promotion on recurring funds, recurring gifts. So my personal experience with them has been quite positive. And for a small shop, I think it's been really ideal for us because the cost has been kept really low. And they were gems to work with. I really appreciated them. The other thing that my colleagues just told me about is because we've had our own issues with Meta and Facebook as far as campaigning. And if you say anything moderately controversial, they stop your campaigning and kick you off the site. So by no means am I advocating for Meta or giving them free advertising, but they do have a new product called Pixel. So I'm sorry to say this, but for the benefit of smaller charities, that they do have some more kind of customizable options for understanding your audience and doing more kind of specific targeted campaigns, fundraising campaigns.
Okay.
That might be something to kind of look at too. And I mean, my colleagues are the whizzes on this. I just know that this related to things that you were talking about recently, and I popped them in so I didn't forget the thought.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm going to take this moment to also refer to the materials that we shared as the pre-work materials for today's session. And we're going to, when we post this video or circulate this video, we'll accompany it with those materials. But we did have a great presentation again by Dr. Laura Evans of our team, who is a genius when it comes to like creating aesthetic, like, and visualized, content that like really streamlines like what's the message you're trying to get across. Don't like gum it up with like too much stuff. And like it has great examples in that presentation of like a website that really like looks good and helps people be guided to the right information. These are things that like I admit in my own professional experience I have not given enough time to, but I'm very lucky to work with people that have good insights about this, because my instinct will always just be to like write everything out and just hope that that works, right? As opposed to thinking about like how to present information like more accessibly or more appealingly. In that same presentation, we also had a colleague who presented on an initiative to use some of the same methods that like political campaigns in the US had used, of like getting the right lists of people that might be interested in your cause and then figuring out the right cadence of communication with using social media and email and stuff. So just to say, there are like lots of different consultants and strategies that might help refine, like once you've identified who might be interested in what you're trying to do and what the call to action is, like then how do you implement like the right platforms and the right content to make that like work optimally, which is daunting in my opinion to think about, because a lot of us are just trying to like make people aware that we even exist. But if we continue and we do well, like those kinds of considerations are also, I think, a part of this. So, Jen, anything else that you'd like to add? I noticed that one of our wonderful colleagues that's doing this work with an organization is here, and I'm gonna Maggie Felker put you on the spot in just a little bit, but I'll give you I'll make it easy. But before we do that, Jen, anything else you'd like to add from your wisdom or experience right now that you just feel like is like a timely tip or insight that would maybe be relevant for our audiences here?
No, I think I did want to just mention again, like, I said, like, it is hard to be an expert in this field that is changing all of the time, right? Like
Yeah.
there's new everything, and it feels like it's also that a lot of people are trying to get our business. Like, here's the next greatest thing. Again, I mentioned like I watched an entire series on monthly giving and have been watching that, going deep into like AI and helpful. Like, you could study all of the time and still not even know what's out there. What, right? Like Kelly just shared another resource that I'm like, oh, I'm not familiar with that. And I do this full time. We all do this full time. And so I think, to find people who you can be in like and colleagues with. Often we're from small organizations. There are so many of us that are small, and not in terms of money or impact, but in terms of the number of people who are doing this work, and especially fundraising. Find people that you can share resources with, rely on, bounce ideas off of, fully admit, like, I heard somebody say something about legacy giving. I don't know what that is. Does anybody within my kind of group
Yeah.
can explain that, can share a resource? Like, just continue to build that. I am a member of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, which is a global organization here locally in Madison. We are very open to, you do not have to be a member. But again, we are a resource. That is our role in the community. And so come ask, like, we will share resources openly. When we learn something, again, our role is not, there's no purpose in kind of gatekeeping resources or even like what we know. Once it's public, like, let's share it even more public and in within our kind of group. So just find people that you can ask questions to and say, what are you doing? Do you have a sample? We don't have to build this from scratch, because our missions are really important and moving quickly. And what works for one may not work for another, but you can really tweak that just by getting those resources. So
Yeah, and I just want to just sort of reify or like underscore that two things that just came up in those last comments, Jen, so valuable. One is if folks watching this video take nothing else from it, I think what Jen mentions, and I'm gonna like restate, is that this endeavor of fundraising is indeed a professional field and a professional endeavor. That doesn't mean that like volunteers with an organization can't do it. But what I think it does do is it makes us bust the myth, like clarify that like indeed, if you're trying to raise money for an organization, it's not just like a mystical, magical like thing that happens. Like, yes, unexpected things can happen. I've seen it in organizations. A good cause, as my boss, Dean Shim, would say, having the vision and doing the good work is what attracts good resources. But there's this whole process in between that requires like skill and strategy, and people spend their entire careers working on this. So even if we're in a very small organization doing it as a volunteer, learning about what some of those strategies are and being deliberate about it is going to get, I think, better results than just sort of like, I don't know, like we'll throw some stuff out there and hope people donate to us, right? Which I say that was my own perspective as a young professional starting out in this field. Like I wasn't as clear on what a like targeted professional endeavor this really can be. And I think once you realize that, that actually makes it less scary, because it's like you can treat it like anything else that you would do in your life or your work. Whereas I think sometimes people feel like asking people for money is scary. Like, I don't want to do that. But if you think of it as like a strategic, tactical thing, that helps make it actually more approachable. The other thing that I just want to say is like, I have been so impressed working with Jen and the AFP professionals that I know at like how collegial this field is, because it would be so easy for fundraisers and people doing this work to be like, oh, well, I'm trying to compete for these donors or these funds. But actually, this is a field that is shockingly collegial and helpful. And I've been to their events and they really do share information and wisdom. So I do think that Jen's recommendation of seeking out those professional associations where some of this information is shared is a great move. It feels like a very welcoming and open community to me. So